The Abbey of St Edmund. Sigebert, king of the East Angles, founded a monastery in the settlement of Bedrixworth around the year 633. He was one of the first English kings to receive a Christian baptism and education, and did much to promote Christianity in his kingdom. This led him to abdicate to live a monastic life there until he was called to battle, which he initially declined, but was forced to appear on the battlefield as his presence alone would rally the army. He apparently carried only a wand as he refused to use weapons and was slain by the Mercian army. Their leader Penda was against Christian teachings. Little did Sigebert know that the site on which his monastery was built would one day be occupied by one of the largest and most important abbeys in Europe. Fast forward around 200 years to the reign of King Edmund of East Anglia, said to be a just ruler and good to his subjects. All was not calm in Britain at the time, a land divided by different cultures, languages and religions, and subject to ongoing invasions by the Danes. One such invasion occurred in 869, where the Dane general Ivar the Boneless set foot in Suffolk and demanded King Edmund surrender and for him to renounce Christianity. Edmund refused, and was subsequently tied to a tree, shot full of arrows, and beheaded. The actions of King Edmund led him to be revered as a martyr, a man who stood for what he believed against mighty invaders with no hope of survival. Edmund's body was laid to rest in the monastery made by Sigebert, and many miracles were said to be performed at his shrine. This led to Bedrixworth growing in reputation, becoming a pilgrimage site for people from far and wide. Many people made the pilgrimage to King Edmund's shrine, from everyday people right up to kings. Offerings of money or jewellery would be left for the abbey, adding to its wealth. Special badges were sold to the pilgrims as proof that they had made their pilgrimage. St Edmund's badge depicts his martyrdom. In 1020, King Canute ordered a new stone church be built to house St Edmund's shrine, and soon after the first abbot arrived. In 1038, Bedrixworth had its name changed to Sancta Edmund Beirig, St Edmundsbury, and eventually became Bury St Edmunds. The main construction of the abbey was begun in 1081 by Abbot Baldwin, a project that would be well over 100 years in the making. Abbot Samson completed the building of the towering west front of the church towards the end of the 1100s, including a great central tower and lower, although still rather spectacular, hexagonal towers to either side. All of the offerings from pilgrims as well as the taxes from the town paid for the impressive abbey to be built. A description of Abbot Samson can be found in the diary of Brother Jocelyn of Breakland, a monk in the abbey at the time. Abbot Samson was below the average height, almost bald. His face was neither round nor oblong. His nose was prominent and his lips thick, his eyes were clear and his glance penetrating. His hearing was excellent. His eyebrows arched and frequently shaved, and a little cold soon made him hoarse. On the day of his election he was 47, and had been a monk for 17 years. In his ruddy beard there were a few grey hairs, and still fewer in his black and curling hair. But in the course of the first 14 years after his election, all his hair became white as snow. The abbey church was built in the shape of a cross with the head pointing east, as is the tradition with all churches and tombstones. One explanation for this is that Christ's second coming was expected to come from the east. It measured 505 feet long and 246 feet along the length of the west front, making it one of the largest churches in England. Standing in front of the abbey church, you'd see three enormous entrances with bronze doors. Master Hugo, a monk during the time of Abbot Ording, crafted the doors for pilgrims to enter the front of the church. He also made several other pieces for the abbey, including a great bell and a crucifix carved from walrus ivory. Pilgrims entering the church would have been greeted with huge arches and large pillars which were representative of Norman-style architecture. Walking further in, the pilgrims would approach the altar. The inside of the church would be painted in bright colours, and the altar was the brightest of them all. The shrine of St Edmund, the martyr king, and the reason for the church being such a famous centre of pilgrimage is situated behind the altar. This area will be considered the holiest part of the church and vitally important to the construction of the abbey. It's almost hard to imagine how the pilgrims would have felt upon finally reaching the gold and jewel-encrusted shrine containing the body of the martyr king. Would they have expected their lives to be discussed and explored even now, 1,000 years in the future? Such is the influence and importance of the Abbey of St Edmund. The Abbey Precinct covered an area of around 40 acres and contained many buildings and facilities within its walls. The cloisters was an area just outside the church where the monks would spend much of their time studying, meditating, and exercising. The monks lived, ate, slept, and worked in the abbey, and gave up all their possessions and the right to marry to do so. There was also an infirmary to house the monks when they were unwell, but often they contained lots of smaller rooms inside, such as a chapel, dormitory, kitchen, latrines, and a refectory. The monks had to endure bloodletting regularly, as this was thought to keep them in optimum health. The infirmary was also where the monks retired when they were too old to work. Monks made wine from the grapes from vine fields east of the abbey. They also had a brew house where they made beer. Lucky for the monks, they were allowed 8 pints of beer per day. Although they were considered vegetarians, the monks were allowed to eat meat when in the infirmary or when dining with the abbot. The River Lark and the River Linnet ran through the back of the abbey and formed part of the fish ponds called the Crankles. Another use of the river was to power the watermill which ground flour not only for the abbey but for the whole town. There's even an account of the abbot ordering a rival flour mill built outside the abbey to be torn down. This incident is also featured in Brother Jocelyn's journal. The owner of the mill heard of the abbot's grievances with his mill and went to explain. The abbot didn't take kindly to this and replied with the following: "I thank you as much as if you had cut off both my feet. By the grace of God I will never eat bread until that building be overturned. You are an old man, and you ought to know that neither the king nor his justiciar may change anything or build anything within the jurisdiction of the monastery, without the leave of the abbot and the house. And who are you, that you are so very presumptuous? Nor is this without any harm to my mills, as you pretend, for the burghers go to your mill and grind their corn at their pleasure, while I cannot lawfully hinder them, since they are free men. And I would not allow even the mill of the cellarer, which has been newly built, to stand, had it not been that it was built before I was abbot. Depart. Before you come to your house, you will hear what has come to pass in the matter of your mill." The owner of the mill, so concerned with the abbot's threats, decided to pull his mill down himself before the abbot's men arrived. The abbot's palace within the abbey was a show of his importance and wealth. Next to this were palaces for visiting royalty, hosting many kings and queens paying their respects to the shrine of St Edmund. They also had a court of law that was responsible for the entire area known as the Abbey of St Edmund, called the Hall of Pleas. The abbot was the judge. In the front of the abbot's palace was the great courtyard, a large open area with a perimeter of buildings around it. Among these buildings there was a granary, bakery, stables, and all manner of different trades. This was usually an area of much activity and where most of the secular business of the abbey would take place. By the 14th century, opinion of the abbey had begun to turn sour. Residents of Bury St Edmunds and East Anglia were increasingly frustrated and irritated with the power of the abbey and its high taxation upon its subjects. The abbey had slowly taken control of many aspects of daily life of the townspeople, with fines, fees and restrictions that wouldn't be enforced in other towns in England becoming commonplace. The worst of the conflict took place in 1327, where in January around 3,000 people gathered in front of the abbey and forcibly entered. They stole property including the town's charters and fought with the monks. In August, the abbot was kidnapped, and in November the king's soldiers intervened and restored order. The rioters were excommunicated and the town had a fine of £14,000 imposed upon it, going down to £4,000 if the townsfolk behaved. A very large amount of money at the time. They were also ordered to rebuild the abbey gate, which was destroyed during the riots. In In 1381, the introduction of a national poll tax in England led to the Peasants' Revolt, and subsequently more troubles arose in Bury St Edmunds. This time the abbey was invaded and ransacked, and the people murdered the King's Chief Justice and the prior of the abbey. They were decapitated and their heads impaled on pikes. This revolt was brought to an end in 9 days, and once again the townsfolk were fined. The abbey eventually met its demise during the dissolution of the monasteries in 1539 by Henry VIII. His followers invaded the abbey and stripped it of all its artefacts and valuable materials. Without the roofs being maintained, the structure of the buildings declined over time and eventually fell to ruin. Stonework was also removed by many of the townspeople to use for their buildings, furthering the deterioration of the abbey. The Abbey Gate, Norman Tower, churches of St Mary and St James are the only parts of the abbey to survive. I'd like to thank the Bury Society for commissioning this piece and for all the work they do for the beautiful town of Bury St Edmunds. This carving took around 80 hours to complete over a period of approximately 4 months. I used lime wood, a variety of carving chisels and oil paints to create this piece. This depicts the abbey as it may have looked in its heyday. There are unfortunately not many sources for how the abbey looked exactly, but from descriptions and the ruins we can make a fairly good guess. In modern day Bury St Edmunds, the site on which the abbey once stood is called the Abbey Gardens. It's hard not to feel some kind of grand presence when walking through the trees and ruins, and I would encourage anyone to visit. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to catch you again soon.